Your grandparents never let the season end when nature said so. They knew how to extend it, to hold back frost in autumn and bring forward growth in spring. Extending the season meant more fresh food on the table and fewer hungry gaps between harvests. Every method stretched the season wider, giving more weeks of food when it was needed most. Here are 20 ways your grandma extended the growing season. Polytunnels, hoop houses. Our grandparents mastered the art of stretching growing seasons using ingenious tunnel structures. From knee-high low tunnels made of bent wire and plastic that hugged seedlings close to the soil, to towering high tunnels spacious enough for a person to walk through, these protective coverings transformed gardening possibilities. The most resourceful growers employed double-layer systems, creating an insulating air pocket between two sheets of plastic that maintained steady warmth even as frost painted the outer layer. These structures worked like time machines, warming soil weeks earlier in spring for eager planting while neighboring gardens remained dormant, and extending harvests deep into fall when open fields had long surrendered to frost. Inside these protective bubbles, tomatoes continued ripening, lettuces remained crisp, and carrots fattened well past their natural season. With simple materials, hoops of wood or metal, sheets of plastic or cloth, our ancestors created microclimates that defied winter's approach, ensuring food security when others faced empty gardens. Wallow water. Some gardeners of a later generation turned to a clever tool that worked with the simplest element of all: water. Known as a wall of water, this protector was made of clear plastic tubes filled and set upright in a circle around a tender plant. Although the ones your grandparents used would have looked a little more like this. By day, the sun warmed the water, and by night, the stored heat bled back into the cool air, wrapping the young seedling in a quiet pocket of warmth. It was like placing a little moat of sunlight around each tomato or pepper, shielding it from the harsh shifts of spring and fall. The wall didn't only ward off frost, it softened the bite of wind and steadied the soil beneath, giving plants time to take root before the season would normally allow. With this trick, seedlings could be set out weeks earlier, and autumn fruits lingered on the vine longer before the first freeze ended them. Even as alternatives like glass cloches or milk jugs had their place, the water wall remained one of the most reliable ways to stretch a season. Stone or brick heat sinks. Your grandparents never wasted the warmth that the sun gave for free. They planted rows tight against stone walls or lined their beds with bricks, knowing that these heavy materials drank in the day's heat and bled it back slowly after dusk. On frosty nights, when the open fields stiffened with cold, the plants tucked beside stone or brick kept on growing as though the season still held. Walls turned southward caught even more light, their surfaces acting like quiet furnaces once the sun slipped low. Tomatoes ripened a little faster, lettuces stayed crisp a little longer, and young seedlings braved cool nights without faltering. Loose bricks were laid at the edges of garden rows, trapping warmth at the soil line and steadying the chill in the ground. The trick worked in spring to warm cold earth earlier and again in autumn to hold frost at bay. Sun pits or trench gardens. Old gardeners often looked down instead of up when seeking to stretch their season. They dug shallow pits or long trenches, setting their crops a step below the open ground. The earth itself became a wall, holding back wind and trapping the warmth of the sun. By day, the low angle of sunlight poured into the pit, heating the soil and air inside more than the fields above. By night, the surrounding ground acted as insulation, keeping the cold from biting so sharply. Seedlings started in these sunken beds weeks before the rest of the garden could be touched. In autumn, the same trenches shielded carrots, beets, and lettuce, holding them alive long after their neighbors had withered. This method required no bought tools. With earth as their shelter and sunlight pooled into the hollows, these sun pits gave more days of growth with minimal effort. Greenhouses. Your grandparents often built simple glass houses that worked double duty, extending autumn's bounty while jump-starting spring's promise. A frame of metal and panes of glass stood at the garden's edge, catching sunlight through winter's short days. Inside, the steady warmth allowed for seed starting weeks before the last frost, giving plants a crucial head start. While snow piled on the roof, seedlings thrived in trays of soil that never froze. By late February, when outdoor ground remained locked in ice, greenhouse tomatoes and peppers were already sprouting, promising harvests a full month earlier than neighbors without glass protection. These structures not only preserved autumn's spinach, chard, and kale well into December, but also awakened spring's potential long before nature intended. The greenhouse became a bridge between seasons, extending harvests at one end while accelerating them at the other. South-facing raised beds. Your grandparents often built their garden beds up above the ground, framing them with boards, stones, or logs. These raised plots had an advantage the flat earth could not match. They warmed quickly in the first days of spring and drained better after the heavy melts and rains. Facing southward, the sloped face of these beds caught the earliest sun. Seeds germinated faster, and seedlings settled in weeks before the rest of the garden stirred. The warmth lingered in the soil, carrying crops forward into a season that seemed too soon for them. In autumn, the same height spared plants from the first low frosts, as the air moved more freely across the surface and the soil released, stored heat more evenly. With nothing more than placement and a bit of old-school know-how, old gardeners turned their beds into small pockets of extended time. Baskets as covers. Your grandparents often pressed old baskets into unexpected service. On frosty nights, woven baskets were turned upside down over tender rows, their curved sides holding space while the weave let air flow gently through. In the morning, when uncovered plants in the open field sagged from cold burn, the ones beneath the baskets still stood crisp and green. They could be shifted easily from one patch to another, shielding whichever crops needed it most. Young seedlings in spring or lettuces in late fall often survived longer because of this simple trick. Even in light snow, baskets formed domes that kept plants untouched beneath. They were not built for the task, but they fit it perfectly. A basket turned upside down stretched the garden's life forward. Cold hardy crop selection. Cold hardy crops were the backbone of old gardens when the frost came creeping in. Instead of giving up at the first chill, growers simply turned to plants that welcomed the cold. Kale was often the first choice. Its leaves not only withstood frost, but actually grew sweeter after a freeze, the cold triggering sugars that softened its flavor. Spinach behaved much the same, holding strong when other greens collapsed, sending up crisp, dark leaves that lasted well into winter. Carrots were another favorite, their roots buried deep under soil that shielded them from sharp winds. When dug after frost, the roots tasted even richer as the cold coaxed out their natural sweetness. With the right vegetables in the ground, food could be gathered weeks or months longer, ensuring fresh harvests when most gardens had already gone silent. Soil insulation with compost blankets. Old gardeners knew that compost wasn't just food for the soil, it was also a blanket against the cold. By laying down a thick layer of compost over garden beds, they created insulation that buffered soil temperatures through sharp swings of the season. In spring, this cover trapped daytime warmth, helping the ground thaw faster and encouraging seeds to sprout sooner than when bare. The dark surface of compost absorbed sunlight, pulling heat deeper into the soil and giving young roots a comfortable start. When autumn frosts arrived, compost blankets worked the opposite way, slowing the release of heat at night and keeping the soil from freezing too quickly. This simple method meant less risk of sudden losses when the weather turned and more weeks of steady growth. Root cellaring in the ground. Instead of pulling everything at once when frost loomed, your grandparents often left hardy crops right where they grew. Carrots, beets, parsnips, and turnips were left in the soil, covered with a thick blanket of mulch, soil, straw, or even just fallen leaves. The earth itself became a storage cellar, holding the roots crisp and sweet for weeks or even months after the rest of the garden had given up. When the family needed food, they simply dug into the patch and pulled what was required, fresh as the day it was first ready. This practice stretched the harvest without needing buildings, barrels, or baskets, just trust in the soil. It wasn't only root crops that benefited. Kale, cabbage, and spinach were often left standing, shielded by a little soil at their base. Even after a dusting of snow, the plant still sent out leaves that could be picked for supper. It was an effortless way to lengthen the season, ensuring food when the neighbors' tables were bare. Row covers. Row covers were one of the simplest yet most effective tricks old gardeners relied on to stretch the season. A thin sheet of cloth, light enough to float above the plants, was laid over tender greens like lettuce or spinach to shield them from frost. Rain and sunlight still filtered through, so growth carried on as though uncovered, but the chill of night was kept at bay. Folks often set them in place at dusk, pinning the edges with stones or soil, and lifted them again in the morning. This routine gave crops precious extra weeks in autumn and protected young seedlings from the bite of late spring frosts. Some growers went a step further, arching thin wires into hoops before laying the fabric. This raised the cover into a small tunnel, trapping warm air inside while preventing delicate plants from being crushed. The added space allowed peas, cabbages, carrots, and beets to grow on steadily when the season would normally have stopped them short. Cold frames. Old-timers built cold frames close to the soil, nothing more than a wooden box with a clear lid made from a window pane or sheet of glass. The sun poured through, and the trapped heat made the soil inside warmer than the air around it. Seedlings were started here while frost still clung to the fields, safe from sudden chills. In autumn, the same frames held lettuces and hardy greens long past their usual limit, the lid closed each night to keep the frost at bay. The boxes were often cobbled from scrap wood and old windows, yet they offered weeks of extra harvest in both spring and fall. They were small, but their effect on the season was large. Wool or burlap frost blankets. When cold nights threatened, your grandparents often wrapped their young plants with whatever fabric was handy, old wool, burlap sacks, or even scraps of worn clothing. The cloth held in the soil's warmth, kept frost from touching tender stems, and shielded plants from biting winds. By morning, when bare plants in the open garden stood limp from frost, those wrapped in fabric were still upright and green. This method didn't need fancy tools or cost, just the frugality of reusing what was already in the house or barn. Burlap sacks from grain were cut open and draped loosely over rows. Old sweaters or wool scraps were tied around tomato stems, warming them like jackets through the night. The covers were removed after sunrise, folded away, and ready for the next chill. The habit meant seedlings could be planted weeks earlier than usual, and fall crops lingered longer before frost claimed them. The effort was small, but the reward was steady. More fresh leaves, sturdier stems, and baskets of food when the season would otherwise have ended. Passive solar or low-energy greenhouses. Seasoned growers leaned on the sun itself when winters pressed hard. Greenhouses were built with thick stone walls at the back or lines of water barrels along the sides. By day, the stone and water barrels absorbed heat, holding it close until nightfall. Long after the stars came out, the stored warmth still breathed back into the air. While frost cut down beans in the open field, tomatoes and herbs inside these houses lingered for weeks. Even after the first snowfall, the ground stayed damp and unfrozen beneath their shelter. There was no need for stoves or coal, only a clever use of sunlight and design. These houses bought weeks on both ends of the season, giving growers earlier sowings in spring and later harvests in fall. Hotbeds. Long before electricity or heated greenhouses, old gardeners leaned on the natural fire of decomposition to stretch their seasons. They dug pits, filled them with fresh, stable manure mixed with straw bedding, and covered the mound with a layer of soil. As the mixture broke down, it released a steady warmth that seeped upward into the planting bed above. The heat was gentle but constant, enough to keep the soil soft and alive, while the world outside froze. Carrots, lettuces, and winter greens thrived above this hidden furnace, their roots cushioned in warmth while frost lay heavy on fences and rooftops. Seedlings could also be started far earlier than the frost calendar suggested, ready to be transplanted when the rest of the garden was still slumbering. Many gardeners paired hotbeds with glass frames or old window panes, trapping even more heat inside. With little more than manure, straw, and effort, they grew food long past nature's limits. Heavy mulching, straw, leaves, wood chippings. Your grandparents trusted the earth's own cover to keep it alive when the cold pressed in. Straw, leaves, and even wood chippings were spread thick across garden rows, forming a blanket that held warmth in the soil and slowed the creeping freeze. By day, the mulch caught the sun, and by night it released that heat back down into the ground, sparing roots from sharp chills. Carrots, turnips, and beets could be left right where they grew, resting snug beneath the mulch, only to be pulled weeks or even months later, still crisp and sweet as if it were October. Greens, too, benefited, their shallow roots tucked under straw or leaves, shielded from sudden frosts that would have ended them otherwise. The mulch not only guarded against cold, but also held in precious moisture and broke down slowly, feeding the soil for seasons to come. It was the simplest and most natural shield, built entirely from what the land itself had already given. Plastic mulches. As farming moved forward, many old gardeners adopted plastic mulches to stretch the season. Sheets of black plastic were spread flat across the soil, soaking up sunlight by day and releasing it slowly into the earth at night. Clear sheets worked differently, trapping warmth like a greenhouse and raising the soil temperature even further. Holes were cut into the sheets, just large enough for seedlings to poke through. Their roots nestled in soil that stayed warmer and more stable than the bare ground around them. This steady warmth meant crops could be planted weeks earlier than usual, with seeds germinating faster in the protected rows. In autumn, the covers held that same heat, giving tomatoes, peppers, and squash valuable extra days to ripen while uncovered fields fell to frost. The plastic also suppressed weeds, saving time and effort in the busy months. Planting a storage crop. Your grandparents often grew with two goals in mind: food for today and food for tomorrow. Alongside crops meant for fresh eating, they deliberately planted a second round that was set aside for storage. This storage crop wasn't picked early or eaten at the table while tender. It was left to mature fully, its purpose to last through winter. Carrots, cabbages, potatoes, and beets were some of the most common choices, their sturdy roots and heads built to endure months beyond harvest. By planning this way, families could enjoy the first sowings fresh: crisp lettuce, young carrots, and tender cabbage, without worrying about running out later. Once mature, storage crops were pulled and packed carefully into cellars, pits, or bins lined with straw. Some were buried under mounds of soil or stacked in cool barns, each method keeping them edible long after the garden outside had gone dormant. Succession planting. To keep fresh food coming without gaps, old gardeners learned to stagger their sowings rather than plant everything at once. Instead of dropping all their lettuce or radish seeds in a single day, they sowed a few rows each week. As the first patch reached maturity, the second was already halfway grown, and another just beginning. This steady rhythm meant there were always tender leaves and crisp roots ready for the table, not one glut followed by nothing. The same habit carried across crops: peas sown in intervals, beans started in stages, and even cabbages planted in shifts, so harvests rolled out smoothly. By pacing their planting, gardeners stretched the season naturally, avoiding the feast or famine cycle. While neighbors scrambled to eat or store a sudden surge of vegetables, these staggered rows ensured baskets of fresh greens and roots kept arriving week after week, right through the changing seasons. Newspaper cones. Not every grower had the luxury of glass, but most had newspapers. Your grandparents folded sheets into cones and slipped them over seedlings when frost threatened. By day, the paper trapped the soil's warmth, and by night it stood as a barrier against the cold. These makeshift covers were light, quick to use, and easy to replace after rain or wind wore them down. In spring, the cones gave new sprouts protection weeks before the frost had fully left. In fall, they returned to guard lettuce and herbs when the chill came creeping back. What might have been scraps of paper on the floor became shields that stretched harvests past their limit. A folded page was all it took to keep food alive longer. Which of these old tricks would you use to keep your harvest going longer? Let us know in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel if you learned something new today. See you in the next one.